Before I go back to the last part of that quote to make sure you got it clear, let me just say something. On the one hand, I apologize for there's some difficulty in keeping your attention and having you fully enjoy this, reading quote after quote after quote. The problem is, it's the only way we can establish these things. I mean, I could sit here and tell you what I think and what I believe, but I'm giving you quotes, some from creationists, but largely from evolutionists themselves, in which it documents what they really believe and are really doing on the one hand. On the other hand, even by their own admission in many cases of the severe problems of these things. And there's just no other way to do it. I can't drag you out in the field and demonstrate and prove my point out in the field. I'm not a geologist. I don't have the funds to do that. In fact, most creationists don't have the funds to go out there and do this kind of research because most of the money for this kind of stuff is only given to evolutionists. So, unfortunately, I personally find these quotes exciting. But for any of you who are struggling with this and tending to doze off with it, I apologize, but that's the only way we can do this. Okay, let me go back to his quote again now, the last part of it. He says, this is Schindewolf, he says, owing to the irreversibility of evolution, that's an assumption on his part, these fossils, offer an unambiguous, in other words, there's nothing vague about it, it's crystal clear, they offer an unambiguous time scale, putting them in a certain time frame, for relative age determinations. In other words, this one is older than this one, etc. Okay, the fossil down here in this older layer is older than the fossil above it. The simpler life form is older than the more complex life form. That's based on their belief of the irreversibility of evolution, and therefore fossils found in so-called progressive layers. So they offer an unambiguous time scale for relative age determinations and for worldwide correlation of rocks. So if you find a fossil in a rock layer over here in Minnesota, and then you go over to Germany and find that same fossil in a rock layer over there, those rock layers are the same age and the same layer of rock laid down during the same geologic period. That's what he's saying is true, based on his assumption that evolution is true and that therefore the irreversibility of evolution compels us to draw those conclusions.
What
Yes?
If that fossil or that creature survived a number of...
What if that creature survived a number of geologic periods? Well, again,
there is such a thing as a geological period.
Okay, there isn't such a thing as a geological period in that sense at all. But given their frame of reference, that there are these geologic periods, the question is, what if that fossil, that creature represented by that fossil, survived several geologic periods? Well, if they would say, okay, here's a creature that lived through 3 geologic periods, then the only thing they could use that fossil for in their frame of reference would be to say it falls within those 3 periods. But index fossils are fossils they claim are creatures that are unique only to one geologic period, in spite of the evidence to the contrary. Even though they might find it generally true, enough generally true that they think they can go ahead and claim it, they just ignore the things that contradict that. But there are certain creatures that are so completely found throughout every period, they would then say, well, those are creatures that weren't extinct during that time, and they can't use that to particularly date an individual period. So the index fossils are, in their belief system and their misstatement of the facts, are unique to a single geologic period, even though that isn't true. That's what they hold to be true. Okay, David.
How do they differentiate between the geological periods, and is there such thing as a transitional period? And is it the geological periods universal as far as all over the Earth?
Okay, well, as I said in the introduction last week and this week, the truth is the geologic periods are not universal over the surface of the Earth. Even in the best case, they don't find all 10 anywhere. In 85% of the Earth, 80 to 85% of the Earth, they don't find more than 5, in many cases many less than 5 layers in 80 to 85% of the Earth's surface. And in many places, they find no more than 2 in the supposedly correct order. Okay? So this whole thing is just a complete fantasy.
But when they romantically envision their theory in reality, they would say that it would be uniform, right? Or do they
Okay.
come right out?
Well, they don't like to talk about it, but they will admit that there are things that are anomalies that are contrary to their view, but then they try to explain those away as saying, well, there's a thing called overthrust. Here's an older layer that through an earthquake or something of that nature forced the older layer up over the top of a younger layer, and so that's why that's out of order. Well, the fact of the matter is, overthrust is obvious. If you find an overthrust situation where it's physically been shoved up over an older layer, supposedly older layer, shoved up over a supposedly younger layer, that's obvious. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about where it's clearly been laid down just the way it was found. But they won't and can't acknowledge those things.
Well, how would they describe what makes a geological period?
Okay, what makes
it a different one?
All right, what makes a geologic period and makes it different from other supposed geologic periods is the different life forms that are found in that, starting with the early simple life forms all the way up to the more complex life forms, and obviously in their view, the simple life forms being in the older, ancient layers, early layers, and the more complex life forms being found in the more modern layers. It's all totally built utterly on the evolutionary assumption and presumption. There isn't any actual basis for these layers being geologic periods other than that assumption. Again, they will try to make you believe that each of these rock layers is distinct in itself, apart from the fossils, but in fact they only identify them by the fossils. The rock material is all sedimentary, and though you can see different layers of sediment, it's still all the same kind of rock. And that, again, the only distinction for them in geologic periods are those index fossils, which they've chosen to hold out as a marker for a particular geologic period.
See, to me, when they use the fossils to define the geological period, that's almost like circular reasoning.
Well, that's an excellent observation, and we're going to be reading some quotes that directly deal with that. And that's exactly correct. It's all circular reasoning. All right, we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, all right, we're dealing with the fact that, in fact, the evolutionists, even though for popular consideration, most of them will hold out the lie that radiometric methods of dating have somehow proven absolutely their belief system. The real fact of the matter is, as we just read from Schindewolf, the only chronometric scale applicable in geologic history is furnished by the fossils. They use the fossils to provide their dating system for the various so-called geologic periods. Here's another quote from two men, von Engelen and Castor, in a book called Geology, in which they said this. These are both evolutionists. They said, historic geology relies chiefly on paleontology. That's the study of fossils. Historic geology relies chiefly on paleontology, the study of fossil organisms. The geologist utilizes knowledge of organic evolution as preserved in the fossil record to identify and correlate the lithic records or rock records of ancient time. Now that's all a fancy way of saying they determine which layer is older and which layer is when based on the fossils that are found in the rocks, and the view of that's based on what they called the knowledge of organic evolution. Okay? Now, organic evolution has not been proven, but they hold it to be a fact, and then they date the layers in the rocks based upon that. And this, in fact, this method of dating, this fossil method of dating, is still the chief method used to this very day in this whole system. Now, it's not uncommon for paleontologists who believe in evolution. There are creationists who study fossils. Okay, so not all paleontologists are evolutionists, but most are. But those who believe in evolution, they date the fossils by the rock layer in which they're found. They find some rock layer that's been claimed to be a particular geologic period, and then they'll date the fossil accordingly. But they also date the rocks themselves by the fossils that are in them. And as you said, that sounds like circular reasoning. Indeed it is. But listen to a precise statement of that circular reasoning. It's not stated as circular reasoning, but listen to this man's statement about this what they do. This is Carl O. Dunbar, who was a geologist at Yale. I don't have the date of this, but it was in a book he wrote called Historical Geology. This goes back, I know it goes back at least 30 years that he happened to write this. It hasn't changed. The quote is still up to date, but that's who this guy is. He's an old Yale geologist. He said this, listen very carefully. Follow every step. He says, inasmuch as life has evolved gradually. Do you see the assumption right there at the very beginning? Inasmuch as life has evolved gradually. That's held to be a fact. Okay. He then says, changing from age to age, he says the rocks of each geologic age, okay, each geologic period, the rocks of each geologic period, bear distinctive types of fossils unlike those of any other age. In other words, the fossils of these early life forms which evolved into later life forms and then became themselves extinct. Okay? So if in fact you believe, if in fact you had evidence to prove that life had evolved gradually, then that statement would be true. Okay? He says, conversely, each kind of fossil is an index or a guide fossil to some definite geologic time. Okay? So he starts with the assumption that life has evolved gradually. Therefore, he concludes that each geologic age will have fossils unique to that age based upon their gradual development from simple to complex over the entire group of periods of the geologic periods. And then he also says that in reverse, therefore, that the fossils that are unique to a particular time period can give you a definite geologic time for that rock layer. He says fossils thus make it possible to recognize rocks of the same age in different parts of the Earth, and in this way to correlate events and work out the history of the Earth as a whole. They, the fossils, furnish us with a chronology, with a time sequence, on which events are arranged like pearls on a string. That's Carl O. Dunbar, Yale geologist. Now, I hope you can see the circular reasoning and all of that, but the statement is based upon the whole thing that he stated is based on his opening premise, stated as a fact, unproven, that inasmuch as life has evolved gradually. But then notice, he goes on. And as we go through this, note his assumptions and his circular reasoning. He says, since fossils record life from age to age. Now see, he can say that since he's just demonstrated that logic from the original assumption. Okay? So he says, since fossils record life from age to age, fossils show the course life has taken in its gradual development. The facts, quote unquote, I'm putting quotes around it, that the oldest rocks bear only extinct types of relatively small and simple kinds of life, and that more and more complex types appear in successive ages, gradually successive newer and younger rocks and rock layers, he says. This shows that there has been a gradual development or unfolding of life on Earth, unquote. You see what he's done? He assumes the gradual evolution of life, changing from age to age gradually over a long periods of time. He assumes that as a fact. Then he draws the conclusion that since that's true, each successive layer of rock is going to have the older life forms in it progressing up to the modern life forms. And therefore you can use those fossils to correlate the age of those layers and determine the age of those layers of rock. Then he says, since fossils record life from age to age, you got that? They show the course life has taken in its gradual development. How does he know that the fossils record life from age to age? It's based on some original assumptions. Now, what has he proven in this statement? What's he proven? Nothing. He's proven nothing. He starts with an assumption. He proves his assumption with his conclusions he drew from the first assumption. But it's to the undiscerning who want to believe in evolution, It sounds so reasonable. And most will not face the circular reasoning that is totally evident within those statements. Here's a quote from A.E. Wilder Smith, who has a Ph.D. and a whole string of degrees after his name that I don't even know what they are. I mean, there's so many of them and they're so different, I don't even know what they all stand for. But anyway, this guy is brilliant. He's a creationist. And he says this. This is from his book called Man's Origin, Man's Destiny. He said this: so firmly does the modern geologist believe in evolution up from simple organisms to complex ones over huge time spans, that he's perfectly willing to use the theory of evolution to prove the theory of evolution, which is what Dunbar, we just quoted, does. He says, one is applying the theory of evolution to prove the correctness of evolution. For we are assuming that the oldest formations contain only the most primitive and least complex organisms, which is the basic assumption of Darwinianism. If we now assume that only simple organisms will occur in old formations, we are assuming the basic premise of Darwinianism to be correct. To use, therefore, for dating purposes, the assumption that only simple organisms will be present in the old formations is to thoroughly beg the question. It is arguing in a circle. Okay? That's totally what they're doing. They're arguing in a circle. They're making an assumption. They're drawing conclusions from the assumption. They use their conclusions from that assumption to then prove their initial assumption. That's what they're doing. Here's how they, in effect, date. Okay, you ask this evolutionist, well, how old is this fossil you got there? Oh, that fossil is 100 million years old. You say, well, how do you know it's 100 million years old? I mean, as I look at the fossil, I don't see a date plate on it. It doesn't say on the back here, made or formed or died and was buried in the year 100 million years. There's no plate on it that tells you how old it is. Okay? So how do you know? And they say, well, that's simple. We found it in a rock that's 100 million years old. Well, how do you know the rock's 100 million years old? Well, the geologist told me. So you go over to the geologist. You go to a different department across the campus, to a different department. You go to the geology department now. You get your geology professor. You say, Professor, how old is this rock? He says, that's 100 million years old. How do you know it's 100 million years old? Well, because there's a fossil in it that we happen to know is 100 million years old. So therefore, the rock has to be 100 million years old. Well, how do you know the fossil is 100 million years old? The evolutionists told us that. The biologists over there, they told us that. And they use each other to date each other. They have no solid ground upon which to give these dates. They simply support each other, and there's no end of the circle. There's no starting point, there's no ending point. It's totally a circle. What? A lot of dating, and we know that most of us here don't believe in dating. Okay, it's simply, pure and simply, circular reasoning. Dr. Luther Sutherland, who is a Christian and a creationist, wrote an article in the Bible Science newsletter called The Geologic Column, Its Basis and Who Constructed It. And in this, he quotes a 1979 interview with Dr. Donald Fisher, a state paleontologist of New York, this is an evolutionist, in which he admits the circular reasoning, and he says, in reference to it, of course, how else are you going to do it? You got that? When confronted with the circular reasoning, he admits, of course, it's circular reasoning. How else are you going to do it? Here's a quote from Larry Azar in an article he wrote in Bioscience magazine called Biologists Help. Quote, are the authorities maintaining, on the other hand, that evolution is documented by geology? And on the other hand, that geology is documented by evolution? Isn't this a circular argument? Now, this is an evolutionist who's saying, hey, this isn't exactly making sense, guys. So you got to come up with something to help us here, because this isn't helping. That's why the article is called Biologists Help. Quick, give us some help. An evolutionist and paleontologist by the name of Niles Eldridge, in a book called Time Frame, said this: And this poses something of a problem, he says. If we date the rocks by their fossils, how can we then turn around and talk about patterns of evolutionary change through time in the fossil record? So again, there are some evolutionists out there who recognize the problem of the circular reasoning, and they address it, but they don't have an answer for it. They don't say, so that's obviously wrong, so here's how we correctly date these things. They don't have an answer, and they're screaming, crying out to their fellow evolutionists to come up with an answer, because this is silly. So there are some out there that are relatively honest. If they were totally honest, they'd become creationists. But they're not that honest. They're just honest enough to recognize they got a problem. An evolutionist by the name of Tom Kemp, who is the curator of the University Museum of Oxford University over in England, in the New Scientist magazine, in an article called A Fresh Look at the Fossil Record, said this, quote, "A circular argument arises. Interpret the fossil record in terms of a particular theory of evolution, inspect the interpretation, and note that it confirms the theory." And then he says, well, it would, wouldn't it? In other words, he's saying, you take your assumption, you interpret your evidence according to the assumption, and then you take the evidence and say, hey, that proves my assumption. And he's saying, well, it would, wouldn't it? Evolutionist researcher J. O'Rourke, in an article in the American Journal of Science, said this. The article is called Pragmatism versus Materialism in Stratigraphy. Stratigraphy has to do with the layers and dating the layers. Materialism would be, in this context, refer to the physical evidence and the facts. Pragmatism, everybody know what a pragmatist is? A pragmatist is one who operates on the premise that if it's practical, use it. Go by it. He doesn't go by any principles or go by truth. It's whatever works. If you can get the results you want by this method, use it. Okay? That's what pragmatism is. So his article is called Pragmatism versus Materialism in Stratigraphy. He says this, he's an evolutionist, the intelligent layman, in this case, that's us, okay, has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date fossils and fossils to date rocks. Now, he's very nice to call us intelligent laymen. It doesn't even take a very bright layman to really notice this, or at least if it's called to his attention and say, yeah. He says the geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply. Here's the geologist feeling that the explanations are not worth the trouble, as long as the work they're doing brings results. He says this is supposed to be hard-headed pragmatism. Now, we go out in the field and we dig around and we come up with the great ages we want based on the way we're doing things. That's all that matters. And the truth of the matter is, it's a little bit like Hitler, who in his book Mein Kampf said, a lie repeated often enough becomes the truth. And so they don't care about the few people, relatively speaking. It's a lot of people in numbers, but it's very few in terms of percentages, who ever try to make an issue out of this or call it to anybody's attention. The masses of people never think about it and don't care. The masses of people, whether they be Christians or non-Christians, don't care about the issue of the circular reasoning or the complete lack of any solid basis these people have. So they can get away with simply going out and saying, hey, we went out there and looked and we saw it, it's this old. And it doesn't matter that it's based on a false assumption, it's based on circular reasoning. They just keep on doing it and putting out their supposed results based on their premises, which are circular and false, and it works. People buy it. Somebody the other day, in reference to some current events, said to me, I know just about this much about this as you do. I've seen all the news reports. And this person is accepting as true whatever's put on the news. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of what's put on the news, especially in this particular instance, is a deliberate, planned lie. But this individual, who's otherwise a very conservative thinking individual and otherwise appears to be intelligent, simply accepts it as being true. And that's what these people go by for the most part in their practice. They're not willing to take the time to try to come up with any kind of a good reply. Part of the problem is they can't come up with a good reply. But why bother to take time to try to come up with a good reply when it works to just keep repeating the lies and most people buy it? David.
There are some people too that are making quite a bit of money by writing quite a few books. Carl Sagan, for instance, it's not worth his while. He just got paid $100,000 to debate somebody.
Right.
It's foolish for him because not only being a pragmatist, he's making a lot of money.
Right.
He's a guru of a lot of this.
That's true. There are those gurus like Sagan who do make lots of money with their books and all the stuff they do. But even for those that are not, quote unquote, making a killing at it, they know where the money is. These researchers, they get their grants to go out and dig around in the fossil record and to dig around in these so-called periods of the geologic column and to come back with things that supposedly support evolution. And they don't have any motive or motivation, rather, to be honest because the money comes from those who want an evolutionary result. The Christians who believe in creation don't have the funds, for the most part, to financially support the tremendous, extensive digging and all that has to be done to in any way seriously challenge the vast majority of the digging that goes on out there, because the money is held by the evolutionary world.
I have a dumb question.
Oh, well then don't ask it. But see, there are no dumb questions. There are no dumb questions. All right. All right.
How deep are the oldest, what they claim in the framework? How deep are they, these oldest?
How deep are they? Well, there's about 5 layers, five so-called geologic periods, 5 different supposed periods represented in the Grand Canyon, which is a mile deep.
Where did all the dirt come from?
Where did all the dirt come from to cover up and make these layers gradually building up over the years? That's something that I've always pondered. Of course, there is no good answer to the question because
everything's getting covered up all around the world, a mile deep.
Where's all this stuff? Before you comment, let me make sure we have on tape the point he's raising. These layers are gradually laid down over millions and billions of years, and we have a building up of these layers and a burying of these things with quote-unquote dirt, as Kelly puts it, and building up over these millions of years, all over the surface of the earth. Where is it coming from? How is that happening? In fact, what do we see in real life occurring through time, except where something is buried by a landslide or lava pouring out of the mountain and down over a town to bury it, or a flood? Other than that, what's happening to the surface of the earth in most places? It's eroding. It's being blown away. It's uncovering. It's not burying. So the question is, where's all that come from to do all this? I don't believe I've ever heard them explain where that comes from to do all this.
Something else has to be getting uncovered to cover something else.
Right. That's true. So you're raising a question that's dirty to raise a question like that. The evolutionists don't think that's fair. Okay. David.
Stuart Kramer was once talking about the tour guide at the Grand Canyon, and he'd always explain, I'm not sure how he would explain it, he had this can thing where he'd tell people about how, over the billions of years, where the sand would just go down, and that's how they came about the Grand Canyon. And some little boy asked him, well, where'd all the dirt go? Mm-hmm. So he ceased to ask that question. He never ever talked about it again. 40 years later on his deathbed, his last words were, where did all the dirt go? Right? It's just something that, I'm not sure what the story was, how he explained it, but... You
mean the boy who asked the question, he stopped asking about it on his deathbed, he was still saying, where'd all the dirt go?
I mean, this little boy just asked the question, well, where's this, he just made up this story.
Now, who on his deathbed said, where'd all the dirt go?
The retired tour guide.
The retired tour guide?
Yes,
okay,
who
yeah.
used to just make up, the little children, he'd make up the story about where all this...
But it bothered him. He knew that it didn't answer the question of where'd all the dirt go.
That question, okay. It just bothered him, so he just ceased to tell that. 40 years later, you're on his deathbed.
Okay. All right, let's go on here. We're running out of time, and I want to get a little more accomplished here before we finish tonight. Here's a quote from an evolutionist by the name of R.H. Rostall, who was a lecturer in economic geology from Cambridge University And this is from an article he wrote in the Encyclopedia Britannica. You know, all those articles, and every little segment, you look up things in the encyclopedia, every one of those individual things are written by one or two people, usually one, who is a contributor to the encyclopedia. So here is Rostall contributing to the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is back to 1956. I actually haven't looked in later editions to see if it's still admitted, but he wrote this in 1956 in the Britannica. He says, it cannot be denied that from a strictly philosophical standpoint, geologists are here arguing in a circle. Now, before I give you the rest of the quote, in a sense, he's sort of dismissing it a little bit by calling it a philosophical standpoint. You see, if you take a course in logic, in the logic course, you're taught that if you reason in a circular fashion, having no solid ground upon which to start, it's fallacious and is illogical. Okay? It doesn't demonstrate truth in any form. And that you take that course of logic, not in the mathematics department where you'd think it might belong, but in fact you take it in the philosophy department. And philosophers have this great concern to be consistent and logical in their conclusions that they draw in their sitting around and pondering their navels and the meaning of life. There's a big word, I've forgotten what it is now, but it's in the dictionary. There's a big word for a person who sits and ponders his navel. And it's the same as a philosopher, actually. But anyway, nevertheless. Okay, he says, it cannot be denied from a strictly philosophical standpoint, geologists here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by the study of their remains, that's the fossils, embedded in the rocks. And the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of the organisms they contain. Here's a quote from Michael Ord. That's O-A-R-D. I don't know if that's correctly pronounced. He's a Christian and a creationist who wrote an article called Ice Ages, The Mystery Solved. And part 2, the subtitle is The Manipulation of Deep Sea Cores. He published this in the Creation Research Society Quarterly, and he says this: a few people realize the index fossil dating system, despite its poor assumptions and many problems, is actually the primary dating tool for geologic time. Even though absolute dating methods, which is the radiometric methods, and the word absolute dating methods there is in quotes because it really isn't true, but they call it absolute dating when they use radiometric method of dating at all. Even though absolute dating methods have been widely touted to be accurate, this is not the case at all. The radiometric methods, have many serious problems. In other words, radiometric dating methods are actually fit into the geologic column, which was set up by fossil dating over 100 years ago. Fossil dating over 100 years ago determined the age, supposed age, of these various geologic periods. And then when they come along and do any dating at all with radiometric dating, where they can, they simply say, oh, yeah, we dated this rock and it fits this. There's tons of results they just simply throw out because it doesn't fit. Which brings us, in the few minutes we have left, to start talking about radiometric methods of dating. Now, even though most of what I've read here tonight in these quotes should be sufficient to say, hey, it doesn't have any bearing on the subject, we do need to understand it because it constantly comes up. If you would make the statement to even most Christians who would be holding forth, if somebody would say, well, yeah, 100 million years ago, this, and you would say to them, well, you realize, of course, don't you, that the earth is only about 6,000 years old, give or take 100 years. God created everything 6,000 years ago. That things are not millions of years old, let alone hundreds of millions of years old, or even for that matter, tens of thousands of years old. If you make that statement to try to correct their incorrect belief, almost always in the discussion they'll bring up, yeah, but they've proven that the earth is that old. They've proven how old things are. They've got these uranium lead methods of dating, and they got these radiometric methods of dating, and they've proven it. It's proven. It's a fact. And I quoted a few weeks ago out of a book written by a Christian that our family happens to be very well acquainted with. I made some quotes in there about his statements about, how old really is everything and what is a day and all that, where he just kind of set aside the literal interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. You remember my reading out of that book? Well, in that, he makes passing reference to the scientific evidence for great ages. and alludes to the scientific methods of dating that they have, referring to the radiometric methods of dating. Everybody always brings that up as if that's some kind of absolute proof of something. Well, how does it work? What is it? Let's take carbon-14 as a starting point, because that's the most popular one. That's the one almost everybody who knows anything at all knows something about. Because you hear it, you read about it in the newspapers, it's just this common thing. They throw it out, mention carbon-14 dating, and boy, you just know it's true. Here's what goes on, and this is going to be introductory pretty much because we're running out of time here, and I don't have time to do full justice to it. We'll pick it up next week and cover it more thoroughly. Carbon-14 is a radioactive form of carbon. Okay, we all know what carbon is. This substance is a part of all living things. All living things have carbon in them, and carbon-12 is your normal carbon. But there's a form of carbon called carbon-14, which is radioactive. It's an unstable form of carbon in which it gives off these particles as it gradually converts by decay, they call it, into carbon-12. Carbon-14, radioactive carbon-14, decays into carbon-12. Now, all radioactive substances have a thing associated with it called a half-life, which means this, and it's different for every substance. Carbon-14, a radioactive substance, decays into carbon-12, standard non-radioactive carbon, in a period of about, and don't hold me to this, I'm going to just use this more of as an illustration than a precise thing. Something like 5,700 years, every 5,700 years, half of your radioactive carbon converts into regular carbon-12. Okay? The half-life would be said to be about 5,700 years. Again, if I'm not precisely accurate on that time frame, I'm just illustrating it anyway. And it's within that ballpark. Pardon me?
Close enough.
It's close enough. Okay. So every 5,700 years, half of your carbon-14 converts into carbon-12. So if you have 100 pounds of carbon-14, forget everything else in the world, you have 100 pounds of carbon-14, if you could wait for 5,700 years, at the end of 5,700 years, due to this half-life process, half of that carbon-14 would have converted into carbon-12, and so you'd have 50 pounds of carbon-14 left, and you'd have now 50 pounds of carbon-12. Then in the next half-life period, another 5,700-year period, half of that 50 pounds of carbon-14 would convert into carbon-12. So you'd now have, in two 5,700-year periods, 11,400 years, if there were such a thing, would be now you'd have 75 pounds of carbon-12 and 25 pounds of carbon-14. You see how that works? Now, if it goes through another half-life period, another 5,700 years, you'd now have 12.5 pounds of carbon-14 and 87.5 pounds of carbon-12, and it goes on and on and on. Okay? So let's say, for sake of discussion, that you knew that you started at a certain point in the past with 100 pounds of carbon-14, and you took this blob and you measured today what's there in this 100 pounds, and you found that there were 50 pounds of carbon-14 and 50 pounds of carbon-12. How old is this lump? 5,700 years. It would have clearly gone through one half-life period. If you found that it contained 87.5 pounds of carbon-12 and 12.5 pounds of carbon-14, how old would it be? It would be approximately 1,700,000 years old. Because they're measuring how much carbon-14 is left there out of the 100 pounds and saying, well, it's gone through this many half-lives or fractions thereof, and therefore it's this old. It sounds so completely reasonable. And based on the facts I've stated for you in that simplest possible form, it is reasonable. Okay? Now, here's more precisely some factors that have to do with this. If you just went out and found a lump of carbon that contained some carbon-12 and some carbon-14, how would you know how much was there to start with? You wouldn't. Okay? And you wouldn't go out and find a 100-pound lump that somebody had back then documented to be 100 pounds. You know, if we could start today with a 100-pound lump of this stuff and isolate it in a sealed container and let it go through this process, 5,700 years from now, somebody could come and measure it with the starting point already designated in the modern day, and 5,700 years later could make such a measurement, sure. But in real life, we have a difficulty. How much carbon-14 would we have to start with if we have a bone we're measuring? How much was there to begin with? For that matter, how much carbon-12 was there to begin with? Do we assume that all the carbon that's in this bone was originally carbon-14, and now some of it's carbon-12 and some is carbon-14? Can we make that assumption? We certainly can't make that assumption. Well, they know that. And so the guy that developed carbon-14 dating was a guy by the name of Libby. In fact, back in 1940 or 42, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in developing this radiometric method of dating called carbon-14 dating. And his research resulted in coming up with the system, but here's what he did in developing the system. It was noted by him that carbon-14 and carbon-12, if you make certain assumptions, reach what's called an equilibrium, where the amount of carbon-14 that's coming into existence in our atmosphere and in life, and the amount of carbon-12 as that decays, reaches an equilibrium. So the balance in life, the balance in living things of carbon-12 versus carbon-14 is in equilibrium in a living thing, because living things are constantly ingesting things. And as they ingest things, it maintains this equilibrium balance of carbon-12 and carbon-14. Okay? Now his assumption for that equilibrium was based on his research, in which he concluded that if the carbon-14, carbon-12 cycle of the production of carbon-14, the decay of carbon-14 into carbon-12, etc., were to go on for approximately 29,000 years, that it would reach equilibrium. So he theorized that equilibrium would be reached after 29,000 years of this process from the beginning of time. He therefore concluded that since we all know that we've been here for way longer than 29,000 years, we long ago reached equilibrium. Therefore, he developed an equation and a formula based upon that assumption that we are operating and living and functioning in equilibrium between carbon-14 and carbon-12 in living things. Okay? Are you following me so far? Now, he's made an assumption, has he not, that is based upon what? First of all, the assumption is we've long ago reached equilibrium because we've been here clearly way longer than 29,000 years. So his assumption is we've been here for long periods of time, therefore we have reached equilibrium. But what is that assumption based upon, in fact? It's based upon the assumption of great ages. Is it based upon any proven fact? No. In fact, it's contrary to what we believe the actual facts are as given to us by the one who was there when it was all created and started in the first place. It's contrary to the record of an eyewitness called God. So his whole theory is based upon an assumption that is unproven and contrary to what we certainly believe to be the actual fact. All right? Now we're really running out of time here. I got about 1 minute and I got to totally quit. So I'm going to end this in the middle and I'm going to pick it up next week. There are some other assumptions here. The decay rate of any radioactive substance, but we're taking carbon-14 at the present time, the decay rate of every 5,700 years, half of it decaying in the half-life, is assumed to have been constant and unchanged over whatever time period that they're dating. Let's say they're dating something that's 40,000, in their estimation, 40,000 years old. They're assuming that for 40,000 years the decay rate has not changed. That's an interesting assumption for people who believe that things are continually changing, which is what evolution is all about, to make that assumption. What basis do they have for that assumption? Only the fact that it works. It's pragmatic. And it fits their preference for the moment, even though it's contrary to their fundamental belief system that things are continually changing. So we have two major assumptions on carbon-14 dating, which simply are contrary to any actual fact and are not based on anything substantive. We're out of time. We'll pick up with that next week and see more of the fiction and dream world fantasy of radiometric dating. We're out of time. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, again, we thank and praise you for what you've been showing us.